Well, a warm welcome to today's talk. It's Friday the 6th of May. Now, if you're struggling for time, I'll give you a quick rundown on what this video is about. The excess deaths during the first 2 years of the pandemic, that's 2020, 2021, were 14.9 million. And if we add the data for 2022, we can safely say that it's over 15 million deaths now. The official death figure of reported deaths is 6.2 million. And just a couple of interesting highlights that's come from this data. The proportion of deaths in men has been higher than women in terms of overall mortality, excess mortality, and there's been more deaths proportionately in high-income countries compared to low-income countries. So quite interesting, really, and things we were really desperate to know about a couple of years ago, they're now sort of coming to light, and we can sort of see this pandemic in its context much more accurately. So moving on to a bit of detail there. Official reported deaths. Now that's from this site here, which is pretty good. World Health Organization site. I've put the link there. Hover over a country of interest and it will give you, nearly 1 million deaths there in the United States. Officially reported deaths, the excess deaths is higher than that. It'll give you the global situation, 500 million officially reported cases, 6.246 officially reported deaths, as we said, a gross underestimate. And then it'll give you the detail for countries as well in terms of cases and deaths. So pretty good site, really quite sophisticated levels of information. And the graphics these days are really very, very good. So you can look at the graphics broken down over time, and then it's got further breakdowns if you want it. So, and they're the figures from there, 6.2 million official deaths. Now, this excess deaths data comes from this group here, because it's always good to look at the validity of the data. So this is the group here. It's the Technical Advisory Group on COVID-19 Mortality Assessment, and there's information about them there. And if you go on, it tells you there's basically 5 working groups here. And if we look at working group 1, for example, we see we've got full transparency. We can see who these people are. So this is good. So we've got Professor Bradshaw there as the chair, and then we have the various members, all pretty impressive academics and statisticians and highly relevant people. And this, of course, is just working group 1. It goes on. Pretty impressive, really, that they put all this together. So the World Health Organization, of course, will criticize them many times. The leadership, some of the decisions of the leadership are open to question, of course, we know that. But what you might call the sort of the rank and file, the workers of the World Health Organization, well, they are world-leading people. So and lots of them. So, but I'll leave you to browse that. It's a bit of a who's who of the field, really. So that's how this information was derived, and that was just Group 1. Convened jointly by the WHO and the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Now, the methods they use, also pretty sophisticated. Let's look at some of the methods that they use. So they're the data for that, the information for that. And again, full details on the methodology. So what this really amounts to is a pretty sophisticated paper, really. It's just in different bits and bobs, but it's all there, and it is an impressive piece of work. So methods there, and then for the more numerically minded of us, which I'm not really, a lot of detail there on the methods that they use. So very transparent process. Now, I don't pretend to be familiar with all these modellings here, but it's standard epidemiological and statistical practice, but they've actually enhanced some of the ideas to try and get information where there is information deficits, to try and not exactly extrapolate or interpolate, but to give the most concise estimates possible of areas where data is simply missing. So that is the methods used, and it's all It's all very high caliber material. 14.9 million deaths. So this is the actual paper here from the WHO where they report 14.9 million excess deaths associated with the COVID pandemic. And as we say, this is just 20 and 21. The data for 2022 not yet fully compiled and already at 14.9 million. So it would have been fascinating to know this a couple of years ago, but of course that was not possible. Full death toll associated directly or indirectly with the pandemic. So this is the excess deaths, remember. So this is direct deaths, indirect deaths, excess mortality. For the full 2 years, January 2020 to the 31st of December 2021. Now their confidence range is 13.3 million to 16.6 million, but they're estimating 14.9 million excess deaths. Dr. Tedros, of course, has to chime in. These sobering data not only point to the impact of the pandemic, but also the need for all countries to investigate more resilient healthcare systems. I mean, obviously, who can disagree with this? That can sustain essential health services during the crisis. Of course, I mean, probably you could argue, especially in America and the United States, ordinary healthcare was simply not carried on during the pandemic, and that's a big cause of the excess mortality, of course. That healthcare has been absent. Now, this paper here does actually focus quite a lot on the deficiency of quantitative data gathering from various places. It focuses on that as a fairly major deficit. And if you actually read the details of it, it does make sense that they have got a pretty valid point here. So we're needing stronger health information systems, that was Dr. Tedros. Generate better data for better decisions and better outcomes. So it's not academic, it's to inform decisions and to give us better outcomes. The data is necessary. So excess mortality, the number of deaths that have occurred and the number of deaths expected in the absence of a pandemic. Now this is gathered in different ways in different countries. In the UK, typically we take the average of the last 5 years or the 5 years before the pandemic. In different countries it's done in different ways. And the team were able to account for this to a fairly high degree using different adjustment techniques and modelling techniques. So this is the best data we have. So direct and indirect death. So a direct death would be someone dying of a coronavirus infection. An indirect death would be someone dying of say an appendicitis or a heart attack that wasn't treated because of the pandemic, or as a result of the economic implications of the measures that were taken to combat the pandemic. Now, this doesn't tease this out yet. It's going to be very interesting to find out how many of these, what we might call collateral damage, these indirect deaths, are due to people, for example, not directly getting healthcare, but how many are actually caused by sometimes inappropriate restrictive measures during the pandemic. For example, in some poorer countries, people weren't able to eat for several days at a time because their income for that day is what buys the food for that evening. And very often that was inhibited by the extreme lockdown measures that were instigated in many circumstances due to the pandemic's impact in health systems and society as a whole. Healthcare systems have been overburdened, as we know. That's probably the major factor in the richer countries. Now, deaths can be averted during the pandemic as well. There's been less motor vehicle accidents, less occupational injuries, and especially during the first part of the pandemic, there was a lot less pollution, atmospheric pollution. The problem with pollution in this world is huge. Atmospheric pollution, water pollution. India particularly. I've spent a bit of time working in New Delhi, in India, and I always get a chest infection there. The pollution is so bad. It's terrible. And recently there's been a fire and a rubbish heap, which has made it even worse. These ongoing problems, they actually got better for some time, particularly in the start of the pandemic. So that is interesting, and more data to come from that, I'm sure. Most of the excess deaths, 84%, were in Southeast Asia, Europe and the Americas, less so in Oceania, Australia, Antipodes and Africa. Now this is interesting, very interesting. High income countries, 15% of the total 14.9 million deaths. Low income countries with very low vaccination rates, 4% of the total 14.9 million deaths. So that's 15% of 14.9 million, 4% of 14.9 million excess deaths. And again, this has got things to tell us. So richer countries tended to keep all the vaccines for themselves, but they've ended up with an overall higher overall mortality rate. I think we've got a lot to learn from that when this is more unpicked. But at the moment, it's just pretty crude overall figures. Sex, males 15.7% of the 14.9 million. Females 43% of the 14.9 million. Now this is partly attributable to the COVID itself, of course, but there's clearly other factors. So more men than women have died during this 2-year period. Now I think I'll just show you a graphic, because this varies quite a bit, of course, by individual countries. So here we have excess mortality, cumulative deaths from all causes compared to projections based on previous years. Now that's the zero line there. Now up until recently, Australia has been below the zero line. It's actually had less deaths than normal, which is great. It's just starting to peak above that line now, unfortunately. New Zealand is still below it. Denmark, and remember these are cumulative. So Denmark, which abolished all restrictions quite some time ago now, is stopping the vaccination programme from the 15th of May, or suspending it altogether. Very low excess deaths. Then Canada, then Germany, then the United Kingdom, and then unfortunately the United States. High levels of excess death during the period in the United States, above 15%. So yeah. Anyway, what are people saying about this? Assistant Director for Data Analysis and Delivery, WHO. Measurements of excess mortality is an essential component to the understanding of the impact of the pandemic. Yes. Shifts in mortality trends provide decision-making information to guide policies. This is the key thing. Decision makers to guide policies. The decision-making has not always been good. The policies have not always been good, to put it mildly. To reduce mortality and effectively prevent future crises, of course, is good. We need to learn about the future as we go along. Because of limited investment in data systems in many countries, the true extent of excess mortality is often remains hidden. But as we say, this group did a very good job at estimating it. These new estimates use the best available data and have been produced using a robust methodology and a completely transparent approach, which, as we've seen, is true. So I'm going to give the World Health Organization a big tick on this. In fact, I'm very happy with this. I'm going to give it a big red tick as well. The question marks from the World Health Organization is not the quality of the individual workers. There are question marks over the leadership and the more strategic decision, but in actual terms of collecting data on the ground, they are the best that we have in the world. These people are usually they are the best people at doing this. So Dr. Fall, Assistant Director for Emergency Response. Data is foundational of our work every day to promote health, which is what we want to do, keep the world safe and serve the vulnerable. Of course, hard to disagree with these statements, but they are useful summaries. Need to track outbreaks in real time everywhere. This is the thing. This data now that we're looking at, it's not real time. It goes up to the end of 2021. And we've had to wait 2.5 years into the pandemic to get it. You'd think with all the mobile phones in the world and all the sophisticated technology that we have now, you'd be able to track things much more quickly. We need information technology systems that can actually communicate with each other while still preserving the autonomy of the individual. And this can be done. The NHS collects a lot of data, and the autonomy of the individual is protected. This can be done. It's open to abuse by despotic dictatorships, of course, which is the problem. But it can be done. Humanity has the potential to do this. Now, we know where the gaps in the data are, so the big gaps in the data are known about. So, United Nations Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, the United Nations system is working to deliver an authoritative assessment of the global toll of lives lost from the pandemic. And it is getting more accurate. And we have looked at other papers in the past which gives more localised breakdowns, as indeed this screen is just a sample of that. This work is an important part of the UN DESA strategy, ongoing collaboration with WHO and other partners to improve global mortality estimates, which is good, but only useful if it feeds back into decisions, policy, preventing the mortalities and preventing mortalities in the future. Again, Director of the Statistics Division of the United Nations, data deficiencies make it difficult to assess the true scope of the crisis, with serious consequences for people's lives. They are really going quite strongly on this, that this lack of information has got pragmatic implications. The pandemic has been a stark reminder of the need for better coordination and data systems within countries and for increased international support for building better systems. So it's locally and internationally, domestic and international, better systems, including for the registration of deaths and other vital events. So as I say, this can be done now. The technology is there. I think the problem is just lack of trust in governments that they won't abuse this data. So this is one of those interesting situations. So it means that humanity has the potential to massively improve its own health here, providing the motivations of everyone involved are what they should be. But of course the problems are, we know that we're dealing with human beings, so often they aren't. So whether this is ever going to be achieved is questionable, because the technology to do it is one thing, but the technology to do it in a way that people can see that their own personal data is protected is much more difficult. But a potential massive improvement. And we are collecting a lot more what we might call metadata and megadata. These huge amounts of data, because if you had this, you could just have it all in front of you. And academics could think, oh, I wonder what happens if we improve water supply or something, tap in a few numbers, and you kind of get the result, whereas in the past you would have to do surveys that lasted for years. The opportunity for almost an exponential growth in healthcare knowledge is currently here due to the technology. The fact that you're watching me now, of course, is the amazing technology of a YouTube. And there's somewhat less amazing technology that's surrounding me. But the potential is there. I'm just not as optimistic that it will be profitably used, but it could be. But that's where we are, 14.9 million. So excess deaths. Okay, now in 2022, of course, we've been in Omicron times. Less deaths, but nevertheless more than enough to put it well over the 15 million. This doesn't compare to the 40 to 80 million people that died in the 1918-1919 pandemic. The absolute figures are way lower, and of course the world's population was massively less then. So percentage wise, in terms of real numbers, the death rate from the COVID pandemic is much less than that, and in percentage terms it's way less than that, and that's largely due to the nature of the virus, the way that the virus has evolved to become less pathogenic and more transmissible. And as we've seen, rich income countries that spent a lot of money on vaccines have actually ended up with a higher percentage of excess deaths than lower income countries where there was much lower vaccination rates. That doesn't mean to say that the vaccination program hasn't been effective. We believe we've got very strong evidence that it has, but it does tell us something about rich countries just looking after their own interests. We have a lot to learn from each other. And thank you for watching.